The summer heat of 1990 hung thick over Riverside, Missouri, a town of modest houses, slow afternoons, and secrets buried beneath the quiet. People still talk about that July day when Johnny Cooper, a retired police officer from St. Louis, drove in and never drove out. His blue Ford sedan was last seen parked outside the old Riverside Diner, the kind of place where the coffee is strong and the locals notice everything. Yet somehow, that day, nobody saw him leave. Johnny Cooper wasn't the kind of man who vanished. He was dependable, a father of 2 grown kids, a husband of 30 years, and a cop who spent his life believing that truth was something you could find if you looked hard enough. But that belief would be the very thing that led him down a road from which he'd never return. Before we uncover what really happened, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more true-life mysteries like this one. Every story we tell carries the voice of those who can no longer speak for themselves, and Johnny's story deserves to be heard. On that Friday morning, Johnny had breakfast with his wife, Martha. She remembered the way he folded his newspaper, straightened his badge even though he hadn't worn it in a year, and smiled that quiet, knowing smile of his. He told her he was going for a drive to clear his head, he said. It wasn't unusual. Retirement had made him restless. Yet there was something different in his tone that morning, a trace of purpose she couldn't quite name. "Don't wait up," he'd said at the door. "I might stop by Eddie's if I head back through town." Martha smiled, but unease tugged at her. "You've been off duty for a year, Johnny." "No more chasing ghosts," he kissed her cheek. "Sometimes ghosts are the only ones who tell the truth." By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of copper. Johnny's car was spotted once more near the bridge on County Road 17, and then nothing. No witnesses, no tire marks, no calls for help. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. That night, when Johnny didn't come home, Martha waited by the phone until dawn. She called his old partner, Eddie Miller, who answered groggily but instantly alert. "He didn't come back?" Eddie asked, voice tightening. "That's not like him." Over the next 48 hours, the town buzzed with whispers. Some said Johnny had run off to escape debts. Others claimed he was drinking again. But those who truly knew him refused to believe it. Eddie drove down to Riverside himself, retracing his friend's path, stopping at the diner, the gas station, the bridge. Everywhere he went, people shrugged. Nobody had seen a thing. The sheriff's office filed a report, but within a week the case was already cooling. For Martha, days blurred into sleepless nights, her faith in the world shrinking by the hour. For Eddie, one thought refused to leave his mind. Johnny had gone to Riverside for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it hadn't let him come back. Before his disappearance, Johnny Cooper lived a simple life in the quiet suburbs of St. Louis. His house sat on the edge of a cul-de-sac where lawns were trimmed every Saturday, and neighbors waved from driveways. After 30 years on the force, he'd earned peace, or at least the idea of it. Yet peace, for Johnny, felt like standing still while the rest of the world moved on. Every morning he followed the same routine: coffee at 6, newspaper by the window, and a long stare at the badge framed above his desk. The badge wasn't just a symbol, it was a reminder of everything he'd given and everything he couldn't forget. Some nights, he woke in a cold sweat, chasing echoes of sirens that weren't there. Martha noticed. She always did. "You need a hobby," she told him one morning as she poured another cup of coffee. "Fishing, gardening, something that doesn't involve staring at the past." Johnny smirked. "The past is all I've got, Martha." "That's not true," she said softly. "You've got me. You've got the kids. You've got a whole future left to live." But Johnny didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the mailbox outside, where an envelope waited. No return address, just his name typed neatly across the front. That letter arrived on a Tuesday, and from that moment, something inside him shifted. He read it once at the kitchen table, again in the garage, and a third time that night in bed while Martha slept beside him. Whatever was written there stirred an old ache, something unfinished. The next day, Johnny visited his old partner, Eddie Miller. Eddie was still on the force, grey hair now, belly heavier, but his laugh as loud as ever. He greeted Johnny with a grin and a backslap. "Retirement treating you well?" Johnny shrugged. Better than I expected, worse than I hoped. They sat at Eddie's cluttered desk, the air thick with nostalgia and stale coffee. Johnny hesitated before sliding the letter across. Eddie read it silently, his brow tightening. "You think this is real?" "I don't know," Johnny said. "But if it is, it means someone got away with something back then." Eddie frowned. "You're not a cop anymore." "Let it go." "I can't," Johnny whispered. "I swore an oath. That doesn't expire with the badge." Later that evening, Martha found Johnny in the garage, polishing his old revolver, not because he planned to use it, but because the act calmed him. "You're not thinking of going back, are you?" she asked. Johnny smiled faintly. "Just thinking of where I've been." That night he sat outside under a sky freckled with stars, the letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket. A warm wind rustled the trees, and somewhere in the distance a train horn echoed across the valley. Johnny closed his eyes and wondered if the truth had a way of calling a man back. The letter had reminded him of something he'd buried long ago, something that refused to stay buried. And soon it would lead him down a road Martha would wish he'd never taken. Johnny left before sunrise, the air cool and damp with the smell of rain. The roads outside St. Louis were nearly empty, stretching through fields that shimmered silver in the early light. He drove with the window cracked open, the wind brushing against his sleeve, the letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket. Every few miles he glanced at it, as though it might change if he looked long enough. It hadn't. It still said the same thing, 3 short sentences that had undone 18 months of quiet living. He stopped for gas at a station off Highway 44. The clerk, a young man with grease-stained hands, recognized the badge charm hanging from Johnny's keychain. "You a cop?" the boy asked. "Used to be," Johnny said. "Guess that never really leaves you," the clerk replied, ringing up the sale. Johnny smiled faintly. "No, son." "It doesn't." He filled his tank, bought a cup of coffee, and stared across the road at a billboard for Riverside County. "Welcome home, friends." The slogan felt wrong, almost mocking. Riverside wasn't home. It was a place that carried too many ghosts. The drive grew lonelier the farther he went. Small towns passed like half-remembered dreams, cracked sidewalks, faded storefronts, a lone church steeple cutting the sky. The radio whispered old country songs and static. At times Johnny found himself talking aloud, asking questions that no one could answer. "Why now, after all this time?" he murmured. But silence was the only reply. By mid-morning, the clouds thickened. He stopped at the Riverside Diner, a narrow building with peeling paint and the smell of fried bacon leaking into the air. A waitress named Carol brought him a plate of eggs and black coffee. She had a kind face, but eyes that measured strangers carefully. "You from around here?" she asked. "Used to be," Johnny said, though that wasn't true. "Just passing through." "Not many do," she replied, pouring more coffee. "Most who leave don't come back." Johnny nodded, pretending not to notice the subtle warning behind her words. On his way out, he caught sight of a man in a sheriff's jacket, sitting near the window watching him. Their eyes met for an instant, long enough for recognition, short enough for denial. Johnny walked out without a word. Outside, thunder rolled far off. The rain came slow, then heavy, drumming on the hood of his car. He called Martha before driving again. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice edged with concern. "Yeah," he said. "Just a quick errand. I'll be home tomorrow." "You promise?" "I promise." He hung up and stared at the receiver for a long moment. That was the last call she would ever get from him. When the storm finally broke, the road ahead glistened like black glass. The sign for Riverside appeared out of the mist, white letters, faded and leaning. Johnny took a deep breath and tightened his grip on the wheel. He didn't know it yet, but every mile beyond that sign would lead him into the truth he'd been chasing all his life. By Sunday morning, Martha Cooper's worry had turned into dread. She had called every friend, every relative, and even Eddie Miller twice before dawn. When no one had seen or heard from Johnny, she drove to the local police station herself, clutching a photo of him in uniform. The officer at the front desk took the report politely but without urgency. "Ma'am," he said, "he's an adult." Maybe he just needed space. Martha's voice shook. Johnny Cooper doesn't just need space, he needs to be found. Back at her quiet house, she sat by the phone again, staring at the framed wedding photo on the mantel. The silence in the room felt heavier than the furniture. She couldn't shake the image of him leaving that morning, the way he'd looked at her before walking out, like he was carrying the weight of something he couldn't share. When Eddie finally arrived, his presence filled the house with a restless energy. He was still wearing his badge, his sleeves rolled up, his jaw tight with concern. "I drove down to Riverside," he said without sitting. "The sheriff there claims they'll look into it, but from what I saw, they've already decided there's nothing to find." Martha's eyes glistened. "Then what do we do?" Eddie took a deep breath. "We start looking ourselves." He spent that afternoon calling contacts from the old days. Retired officers, clerks, anyone who might remember Johnny mentioning Riverside. Most had no idea what could have drawn him there. One name came up, though, more than once. Sheriff Alan Briggs, head of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department since the late 70s. "They used to work the same circuits back then," Eddie murmured. Maybe Johnny thought Briggs could help him with something. By dusk, Eddie packed a small overnight bag and left for Riverside again. The drive took 3 hours through winding roads lined with cornfields. As night fell, the headlights carved long tunnels of light through the mist. He arrived at the diner where Johnny's car had last been seen. The parking lot was empty, except for an old pickup and a single flickering streetlight. Inside, Carol, the same waitress Johnny had met, recognized Eddie from the photo he showed her. "He was here Friday," she said quietly. "Drank his coffee, left a $1 tip. I saw him step outside to take a call, then nothing." "Did anyone follow him?" Eddie asked. She hesitated. "There was a man by the window, sheriff's badge on his belt. Didn't eat a thing, just watched." Eddie felt a cold ripple run down his back. He thanked her and stepped outside. The rain had started again, soft and steady. He walked toward the spot by the bridge where Johnny's car had been found 2 days earlier. Only the faint sound of water moving below broke the silence. He crouched beside the guardrail, brushing dirt off the pavement. Something metallic caught the light, a coin maybe, or a fragment of metal. He turned it over in his palm. It was a button from a police uniform. Standing there in the dark, Eddie realized the official search might have ended, but his own was just beginning. The next morning, the air in Riverside felt heavier, as if the whole town carried a secret too old to name. Eddie Miller sat in his car outside the sheriff's office, the button he'd found resting in his pocket. The building looked ordinary. White paint, chipped corners, an American flag swaying lazily in the breeze. But every instinct he'd honed in 30 years of police work told him something inside wasn't right. When he walked in, the receptionist greeted him with a cautious smile. "Can I help you, sir?" "Detective Miller, St. Louis PD," he said, flashing his old badge out of habit. "I'm looking for information on a missing person, Johnny Cooper." The woman's expression shifted. "Oh, that's already been filed. Sheriff Briggs spoke with the state police yesterday. I believe they're handling it." Eddie raised an eyebrow. "Handling it or burying it?" Before she could answer, a door opened behind her and Sheriff Alan Briggs stepped out. He was a large man with thinning hair and the kind of confidence that comes from years of authority. "Miller," he said with forced warmth, "heard you were sniffing around my town." "Just trying to find an old friend," Eddie replied evenly. "His car was found here." Briggs crossed his arms. "And you think we're not doing our jobs?" "I think your jobs might look different from mine." For a long moment neither spoke. Then Briggs smiled thinly. "Careful, detective. Sometimes when you dig for ghosts, you end up joining them." Eddie left the station more convinced than ever that something was being covered up. He drove out toward the county line, stopping at a small bar where retired officers often gathered. One of them, an older man named Hank Travers, recognized Johnny's photo immediately. "Yeah, I remember him," Hank said, voice low. "Good man, tough, but he got mixed in with something messy back in '75, something he shouldn't have." "What kind of something?" Eddie pressed. Hank hesitated, glancing toward the door. "There was a corruption case, payoffs, evidence gone missing. Whole thing got swept under the rug. Cooper was supposed to testify, but then the case disappeared. Rumor was he kept notes, notes that could ruin careers. And Briggs? Hank's eyes darkened. He was just a deputy then, but everyone knew he was climbing fast. The words hung in the smoky air. Eddie's pulse quickened. If Johnny had been chasing that old trail, it explained everything. The letter, the trip, the silence. Back at the motel, Eddie spread the contents of his bag across the bed. Maps, photos, Johnny's service file. The button gleamed under the yellow light. He thought of Martha, waiting at home with hope thinning by the hour. He thought of Johnny's voice, calm and steady, the kind of voice that made you believe the truth always came out eventually. But now, staring at the evidence, Eddie wasn't sure. The people he'd once trusted, men who'd worn the same badge, suddenly felt like strangers. He'd spent his life believing in the system, but maybe the system had failed Johnny long before he ever went missing. Somewhere in that town, Eddie knew the truth was still alive, and someone was working very hard to keep it buried. By the end of that long, grey week, Eddie Miller had mapped out every lead in Riverside. Most were dead ends, conversations cut short, doors closed faster than they opened. Still, one address kept coming up in whispers: the Old Barrow Farm, 6 miles west of town. Locals said it had been empty for decades, but someone had seen headlights there a few nights before Johnny vanished. Eddie drove out on a cloudy afternoon, the sky low and heavy. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, then dirt. Weeds brushed against the sides of his car, and the air smelled of rain and rust. He parked by a sagging fence and looked out at the farmhouse. 2 stories, roof caved in at one end, windows dark. The kind of place time forgot. He stepped inside, the floor groaning under his boots. Dust drifted in slants of grey light. Old photographs hung crooked on the walls, faces long faded. Each room carried a stale echo, as if holding its breath. He checked the ground floor first. Broken chairs, empty bottles, cigarette butts fresh enough to suggest someone had been there recently. Then something caught his eye. In the corner near the old wood stove, a loose floorboard. Eddie crouched, prying it up with the handle of his pocket-knife. Beneath it, wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, was a police badge, tarnished but unmistakable. Johnny's nameplate was still legible. Eddie's chest tightened as he ran his thumb over the engraved letters. He whispered, "Johnny, what the hell were you doing here?" Before he could think further, a sound outside made him freeze, the soft crunch of gravel. Someone was nearby. He moved to the window and saw tire tracks cutting through the mud, still wet, leading back toward the road. He waited, breath held, until silence returned. Whoever had been there was gone, but not long ago. Eddie pocketed the badge and stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The rain had started again, light but steady. As he reached his car, he noticed a single fresh footprint beside the passenger door, larger than his own, half filled with water. He looked around, the feeling of being watched crawling up his spine. Back in town, he stopped at a payphone and called Martha. "I found something," he said, voice low. Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "His badge, out by the old Barrow place. Looks like someone tried to hide it." There was silence on the line before she spoke again. "Does that mean he's—" "No," Eddie interrupted, though he didn't believe his own certainty. "It means he was on to something. I'm not stopping now." That night, he couldn't sleep. The farmhouse lingered in his mind. The smell of damp wood, the faint hum of wind through broken glass. He replayed the sound of that car driving away, the timing too deliberate to be coincidence. Whoever was behind Johnny's disappearance hadn't vanished. They were still here, somewhere in Riverside, watching and waiting. Eddie looked at the badge one more time before placing it on the motel nightstand. It wasn't just a clue. It was a message. Johnny had left it there for someone to find. The following morning, Eddie sat in the Riverside Motel lobby with a notebook open and the badge lying beside his coffee cup. The rain hadn't stopped all night. It drummed on the roof now like a ticking clock. He'd gone over every lead, every name he could remember from Johnny's old cases, but none made sense. There was something connecting it all, something just out of reach. He called the county records office to request property deeds for the Barrow farm. The clerk's tone turned cautious when he gave the address. "That property's been under county control since 1978, she said. Why do you ask? Just routine, Eddie replied. Mind telling me who held it before that? She paused. It was owned by a family called Briggs. Same as your sheriff, I suppose. Eddie felt his pulse slow. You sure about that? Records don't lie, she said, and hung up. He sat still for a long time, staring at the badge. If the farm once belonged to the Briggs family, then the sheriff's connection to Johnny's disappearance wasn't just professional, it was personal. Later that afternoon, Eddie met with Detective Laura Bennett from the state's Cold Case Division. She was younger, sharp-eyed, with that mix of confidence and skepticism only new investigators carried. Eddie had reached out to her after realizing he couldn't fight this alone. So, Laura said, setting her files on the table, you think a sheriff's involved in covering up your friend's disappearance? Eddie looked her straight in the eye. I don't think. I know something doesn't add up. His badge was buried on land that used to belong to Briggs. Tell me that's a coincidence. Laura frowned. Briggs has been in office for 20 years. That's a dangerous man to accuse without proof. Then we find proof, Eddie said quietly. Whatever Johnny found, Briggs wanted it gone. They spent the afternoon going through Johnny's service records and his last few assignments before retirement. Buried in a folder marked Internal Review, they found a handwritten note from Johnny himself. Follow up on missing teen, Riverside, 1975. No details, no case number, just that line. Laura leaned back, eyebrows raised. A missing teen from 75. Briggs was a deputy then, Eddie said. If that case was buried, Johnny might have been trying to bring it back. Do you think he found something? I think he found someone who didn't want to be found. That night, Eddie drove Laura to the old diner to show her where it all started. Carol was working again, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee. When Eddie mentioned Briggs, her lips pressed tight. I'd be careful if I were you, she whispered. People around here still owe that man favors. Others owe him silence. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and river water. Laura looked uneasy. You really think your friend was chasing a 40-year-old case? Eddie nodded, eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. Johnny never let go of the past. The difference this time is, the past didn't let go of him. The next morning broke cold and pale over Riverside. A fog had rolled in from the river, swallowing the town in grey silence. Eddie and Laura stood near the bridge, where Johnny's car had last been seen 18 years earlier. The water below moved slow, almost unwilling, carrying the weight of secrets that refused to drown. An old man sat on a folding chair near the bank, fishing lines slack in the current. His name was Walter Pierce. Locals called him Walt. Laura had tracked him down through a forgotten police log from 1990. He was listed as a witness who'd never been interviewed properly. Eddie approached carefully. Mr. Pierce, we're looking into a disappearance from 90, Johnny Cooper, you remember that name? The man squinted, his face carved by age and sun. Yeah, he said after a pause. I remember him. Saw him that night, too. Eddie exchanged a glance with Laura. You saw him here? Right on this bank, Walt said, tapping the mud with his boot. Rain was coming down hard. I was packing up when I heard voices, 2 men arguing by the water. One of them was Cooper. Can you describe the other man? Laura asked. He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the bridge. Didn't see his face clear, but I saw the badge, shiny one on his belt. Eddie felt the chill before the wind even shifted. A badge? You sure? Walt nodded. Sure as I'm breathing. Thought it was strange. A retired cop meeting another officer this far out at night. What happened next? They moved toward the bridge. I heard shouting, then a splash. When I ran closer, only one flashlight was still on. Then it went dark. Silence stretched between them. Laura scribbled in her notebook, but Eddie could barely move. The river below gurgled faintly, as if echoing the man's words. Why didn't you come forward? He finally asked. Walt let out a bitter laugh. I tried. Went to the sheriff's office the next morning. Briggs himself told me they'd handle it. A week later, my truck tires were slashed. I got the message. Laura's pen stopped. You think Briggs was the man you saw? Walt stared out at the water, his reflection trembling in the current. I don't think. I know. Nobody else around here wore their badge off duty like he did. And nobody else could have made this town that quiet. Eddie stepped closer, lowering his voice. Would you be willing to make a formal statement? Walt met his eyes, something fragile flickering there. I'll tell the truth, but you'd better find proof before I do. Because in this town, truth's got a way of disappearing too. They thanked him and walked back to the car. Neither spoke for a while. The fog had begun to lift, revealing the slow, muddy swirl of the river. Laura finally said, You think he's telling the truth? Eddie nodded. Yeah. And I think we just found the night Johnny died. Or the night someone made sure he never came back. 2 days later, Eddie and Laura met inside a cramped evidence lab at the Missouri State Police headquarters. A forensic technician named Martin was reviewing samples taken from Johnny's old Ford, recently recovered from the impound lot after nearly 2 decades of storage. Dust coated every inch of it, but time hadn't erased everything. Martin lifted a tray under the fluorescent light. You're not going to believe this, he said. We found soil residue in the trunk that doesn't match the riverbank where the car was found. It's from a restricted quarry site, owned by Riverside County. Eddie frowned. You saying the car was moved? I'm saying it was somewhere else first, Martin replied. And get this, under the carpet lining we found a trace of dried blood. Not enough for an ID back then, but with today's tech, he hesitated, glancing between them. We've got partial DNA. It's consistent with Sheriff Alan Briggs. For a moment, the room went still. Laura's pen stopped mid-air. Eddie leaned forward, disbelief and vindication colliding inside him. That's impossible, he muttered. He was the one running the investigation. Martin shrugged. All I can tell you is the data doesn't lie. You wanted evidence, here it is. Back in the car, Laura stared out the window, processing it all. If Briggs's DNA is in the trunk, that means he was in contact with Johnny's car after he went missing. That's obstruction at the very least. Eddie rubbed his temples. It's worse than that. It means Briggs touched the evidence. Maybe moved it, maybe cleaned it. He knew exactly what he was hiding. They drove in silence for a while, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. The afternoon sun burned low, washing the landscape in pale gold. Eddie's thoughts drifted to the years of loyalty, the faith he'd placed in the badge. Every man who joined the force believed in the same code. Protect, serve, tell the truth. But now that oath felt fragile, like paper in the rain. Laura broke the silence. Do we go public with this? Not yet, Eddie said. We need more. DNA's strong, but without context, it's just a trace. Briggs could claim contamination. So what's the next step? Eddie opened the glove compartment, pulling out Johnny's old notebook, the one that had mysteriously shown up in his mailbox a week ago. He flipped to the last page, where a single line was underlined twice. The truth always surfaces. He exhaled slowly. We follow his notes, wherever they lead. Laura glanced over. You think Johnny knew what he was up against? Yeah, Eddie said quietly, and I think he knew someone like me would have to finish it. When they returned to Riverside that evening, the sun was sinking behind the trees, turning the sky to rust. Eddie parked outside the motel and sat for a moment staring at the horizon. We've got proof he was dirty, he said. But proof doesn't mean justice. Laura nodded, her voice firm. Then we'll make it mean something. As the first stars appeared above the highway, Eddie felt the weight of Johnny's badge in his pocket again, a reminder that some debts between cops never really die. The next morning, Eddie and Laura stood in front of the Riverside courthouse, looking up at the crumbling facade. The building had been here for decades, its stone steps worn by time, its windows heavy with the weight of history. Inside, records lay stacked in forgotten rooms, but there was one document they needed more than anything, the ledger from 1975. It was the key to everything, the missing link between Johnny's past investigation and Sheriff Briggs's dark secrets. They had tracked down an old clerk who had worked in the courthouse at the time, a man named Gerald Adams. Now retired, he agreed to meet them after they mentioned the ledger. The three of them sat in a dusty back office, sunlight filtering through the blinds. Gerald's hands shook as he pulled a yellowed ledger from the bottom of a pile. "This is the one," he said, his voice low. "But be careful. This town's got long memories." Eddie flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning quickly. The entries were straightforward at first. Cases of theft, assault, missing persons. But then, near the end of the book, a series of cryptic notations began. Payments, large sums. Some under the guise of community service, others just marked as settlement. Each one had a name attached to it, but one name stood out: Alan Briggs. Laura leaned over his shoulder. "These payments, they're all tied to Johnny's investigation, aren't they?" Eddie's fingers hovered over the ledger. "Every one of these payments went to cover up something. And it looks like Briggs was involved in every single one." Gerald cleared his throat. "There was a girl who went missing in 1975. She was found dead, but the sheriff's office didn't do a damn thing to investigate, not until the feds got involved. They didn't want anyone digging into it. Too many people had their hands in it." Eddie closed the ledger, his heart pounding. "How many people?" "Enough to make sure the case was buried," Gerald replied quietly. "It wasn't just Briggs. It was the whole department. The only reason anyone found out was because of a guy named Johnny Cooper. He never let go." Laura's eyes met Eddie's. "Johnny was onto something big, wasn't he?" "Bigger than we thought," Eddie said. "This isn't just about a missing girl. It's about everything Briggs has been hiding for years." They left the courthouse with the ledger in hand, a new weight on their shoulders. The sun was setting as they drove through Riverside's quiet streets, the town now feeling like a trap, each turn leading them closer to the truth but farther from escape. Eddie's thoughts raced. The connections were there now. The pieces were falling into place. The money, the cover-up, Briggs's dirty fingerprints all over it. Johnny had known all along. He'd been chasing these same ghosts, trying to expose them before they swallowed him whole. And now, Eddie knew what he had to do. He couldn't stop until the truth was laid bare. Until the town of Riverside finally faced the darkness that had been growing beneath its surface for decades. Laura looked at him, her eyes hard with determination. "What's next?" Eddie gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set. "Next, we take this straight to the top. No more games." It was a cold morning when Eddie and Laura walked into the Riverside courthouse, armed with the ledger and undeniable proof of Sheriff Alan Briggs's corruption. They had spent the night reviewing their plan, ensuring every detail was in place. But as they walked through the courthouse doors, the weight of what they were about to do hit them both. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about breaking open a conspiracy that had held the town in its grip for decades. The room was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Eddie and Laura made their way through the hall, past the wooden benches and framed portraits of long-dead officials, their eyes fixed on the office at the far end. Inside, Sheriff Briggs sat behind his desk, a look of quiet authority on his face, as if he had all the time in the world. He didn't know his world was about to shatter. "Sheriff Briggs," Eddie said, his voice firm, but his heart racing. Briggs looked up slowly, a smile creeping onto his face. "Detective Miller, Laura Bennett." "What brings you to my office today?" Eddie didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked forward, setting the ledger on the desk with a quiet thud. "We need to talk about 1975 and Johnny Cooper." Briggs's expression faltered for just a split second, but it was enough. Laura stepped forward, holding out a stack of evidence. "You've been lying to us, Sheriff. And it's over." Briggs's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're doing," he growled. "I think we do," Eddie replied. "You've been covering up a crime for years. You were involved in a series of payoffs, in the disappearance of a young woman, and you were part of Johnny Cooper's forced silence. All this time you've been holding power by controlling the truth. That ends now." The sheriff stood, towering over them, but the anger in his eyes was mixed with something else, fear. "You think anyone's going to believe you? I've got the town in my pocket. You're nothing but a couple of outsiders." "You're wrong," Laura said quietly. "This town may be under your thumb, but the law isn't. You've made a lot of enemies over the years, Briggs. And we've got proof you're guilty of far more than you can handle." With a flick of his wrist, Briggs gestured toward the door. "I suggest you leave now. while you still can." Eddie shook his head. "We're not leaving, Sheriff. Not until you're in handcuffs." Briggs made a lunge toward his desk drawer, but before he could reach it, Eddie was there, grabbing his arm with the force of years of training. Laura quickly pulled out her cuffs, securing him to the chair. The sheriff struggled, but it was too late. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and soon 2 uniformed officers appeared in the doorway. They had been waiting for this moment, and now it was here. One of them spoke softly. "Sheriff Briggs, you're under arrest for the obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and the murder of Johnny Cooper." Briggs stared at them, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. He had been untouchable for so long. Now, in the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. Eddie watched as the officers escorted Briggs out of his own office. He felt no satisfaction, only a cold emptiness that had been there ever since he first realized how deep the corruption ran. Johnny Cooper had been right all along, and Eddie, after all these years, had finally gotten justice. But at what cost? As the door closed behind Briggs, Laura turned to Eddie. "It's over. For now," he said, his voice heavy. "But there's still a lot to clean up." The following days were a blur of interviews, paperwork, and press conferences. Riverside's streets, which had once felt suffocatingly familiar, now seemed foreign. The town, gripped by decades of secrets, was slowly waking up to the truth. The arrest of Sheriff Alan Briggs had sent shockwaves through the community. But despite the relief that came with his capture, Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air, something unresolved. The morning after Briggs was arrested, Eddie and Laura sat in a small room at the Riverside Police Department, reviewing the final pieces of evidence. They had finally received the results of the DNA analysis from the blood found in Johnny's car. It confirmed what they had suspected. Briggs's DNA matched the blood, linking him directly to the crime scene. "The truth is out there, Eddie," Laura said, flipping through the stack of files. "But it still feels like we're missing something." Eddie sat back in his chair, looking at the papers spread out before him. His thoughts wandered to Johnny, to the man who had spent years chasing the same ghost he was now facing. Johnny had never given up, even when the system seemed stacked against him. Eddie admired that strength, but it also hurt. Johnny had died fighting for justice, and the full truth hadn't come to light until now. Laura paused, looking up at him. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking about Johnny. He'd be proud we got this far, but I still wonder what else he knew, what else he was trying to expose." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the case pressing on both of them. Finally, Eddie stood up, his mind made up. "We're going back to the beginning, the missing girl, the case he was working on before everything went wrong." Laura's eyes met his with understanding. "You think that's the missing link?" "I do," Eddie said. "I think everything he was doing led to that one case. And now we finally have the evidence to bring the whole thing into the light." The two of them walked out of the office, determination in their steps. As they stepped into the fresh morning air, the town around them felt different. The signs of decay were still visible, but there was a renewed sense of hope as well. The people of Riverside were finally going to learn the truth about what had happened to Johnny, and the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. The press conference later that day confirmed their findings. With Briggs's arrest, the full scope of his corruption was revealed. He had not only covered up the death of a young woman in 1975, but he had been involved in a long-running conspiracy that included Johnny Cooper's forced disappearance. The revelation of his involvement shocked even those who had long suspected his crimes. As the crowd of reporters dispersed, Eddie stood by the podium watching the aftermath unfold. He had come full circle. But the question still remained. What had Johnny uncovered in his final days that had cost him his life? He glanced at Laura. "We still don't know the full story, do we?" "No," she said, her voice firm. "But we'll keep looking." Eddie nodded. The truth had come out, but there were still pieces left to find. Johnny's legacy was far from over. The weeks following Sheriff Briggs's arrest were both quiet and unsettling. Riverside, once a town defined by its comfortable silence, now hummed with a strange energy, an uncomfortable mix of relief and uncertainty. The truth had come out, and for the first time in years it seemed like the people of the town could finally breathe. But for those who had lived under Briggs's shadow for so long, the healing would take time. Martha Cooper, Johnny's widow, stood in the center of the small community hall, looking over the crowd of familiar faces. The town's annual meeting had been scheduled for that week, but it had transformed into something else entirely. It was a gathering of both grief and renewal. The mayor, now facing intense scrutiny over his role in allowing Briggs's corruption to persist, had been replaced by a local council member. Yet the unease still lingered in the room. Martha addressed the crowd, her voice steady but soft, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Johnny spent his life chasing the truth, even when it wasn't easy, even when it cost him everything. He believed in justice, in fairness, and in the idea that we can always do better. That's the legacy he left behind, and it's the one I hope we carry forward. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, people began to nod, some wiping away tears, others exchanging quiet glances. It was a rare sight in a town where words had often been buried under years of complicity. The town had been broken, but now there was hope it could heal. Eddie and Laura sat at the back of the room watching Martha. Eddie felt a heaviness in his chest. He had spent months chasing down the truth, uncovering the dark underbelly of the town, and now he realized it was Martha who had been carrying the true weight all along. Johnny's death had left a hole in her heart, but it was the kind of wound that wouldn't heal without change, and that was something the town had never truly confronted before. I never thought I'd see the day when people like us, people who loved this town, would get to be heard, Eddie said quietly, turning to Laura. It's going to be hard for some of them. This is the kind of thing that doesn't go away overnight. Laura nodded, her gaze fixed on Martha. It's a start, but it's just that, just the start. The town's going to have to rebuild itself piece by piece. Eddie let out a long breath, feeling the weight of the journey ahead of him. Johnny always said the truth would come out. Maybe we were the ones who needed to hear it. The meeting lasted longer than they expected as people spoke, shared their stories, and expressed their hopes for a new beginning. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Eddie and Laura lingered in the hall, watching the people who had once been afraid to speak. They were standing taller now, their voices no longer drowned out by fear. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over Riverside. The town was still scarred, but for the first time in years it felt like the shadows might finally begin to fade. I think Johnny would be proud, Eddie said, his voice softer than usual. Not because of what we did, but because of what they're doing now. Laura smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft light. Yeah, I think he would be. The trial of Sheriff Alan Briggs was over in a matter of weeks, but the ripples it caused in Riverside would last for years. Briggs was found guilty of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and his involvement in the murder of Johnny Cooper. The town, once paralyzed by fear, now found itself standing at the crossroads of healing and rebuilding. Martha Cooper attended the trial every day, sitting in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. Eddie and Laura were there too, but it was clear that for Martha, the battle was both personal and public. The man who had once been part of the very fabric of her life, the sheriff, the protector, had betrayed her husband and betrayed the town. But now, as he sat across from her in the courtroom, she didn't feel hate. She felt something colder. Closure. The day Briggs was sentenced, Martha stood outside the courthouse, her face calm, but her eyes heavy with years of unshed tears. The press surrounded her, but she held herself steady. Justice has been served, she said softly, her voice reaching the cameras. But Johnny's justice wasn't just about him. It was about every person in this town who has lived in fear, in silence. This town is free now, and it will be better for it. Eddie and Laura stood beside her, watching the reporters scatter. Eddie looked at Martha and then turned to Laura. She's right, he said. The town's free now, but it's going to take time. They've lived too long in the shadows. Laura nodded. The hardest part is yet to come. These people have to learn how to trust again. they'd been taught not to for so long. For the next few months, Riverside was a town in transition. New leadership, new policies, and a new sense of accountability began to take root. The local businesses started to thrive again, the streets filled with new faces, and for the first time in years, the town felt like it was looking forward, not backward. Eddie, now working as a private investigator, kept in touch with Martha and Laura, though his work in Riverside was mostly done. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over, that there was something more. Johnny's case had opened doors that many thought were sealed shut forever. And although Briggs was behind bars, Eddie knew there were more people involved than just one man. One evening, Eddie sat at the local diner sipping coffee and watching the sun set over Riverside. The town had changed, but there were still reminders of the past in the quiet corners of the streets. He had made peace with what had happened, but he knew it wasn't the end. The truth, as Johnny had always said, had a way of surfacing, and there was still more to uncover. As Eddie left the diner that night, he ran into Martha again. She smiled at him, her face soft with the years of grief she had finally released. "How's the town doing?" she asked. "Better," Eddie replied. "But there's still work to be done. You know, Johnny would have loved to see this. It's his legacy." Martha nodded, looking out over the street. "It's not just his legacy anymore. It's ours." Eddie smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. Johnny's fight had been long and hard, but in the end it had made the town better. For the first time in a long time, Eddie felt like he was walking in the light, and he knew deep down that Johnny's truth would carry on for generations to come. The town of Riverside had changed, there was no doubt about that. What was once a place of fear and silence now had the opportunity to breathe again. Yet even with the arrest of Sheriff Briggs and the exposure of so many hidden truths, there were still scars beneath the surface. Johnny Cooper's death, though tragic, had sparked a transformation in a community that had spent years hiding from the truth. But what lingered now wasn't just the aftermath, it was the future. Eddie sat on the porch of Martha's house one evening, watching the sun set behind the trees. The shadows stretched long, and the cool evening air brought a fresh, familiar comfort. It had been several months since the trial had ended, and while the town had begun to heal, Eddie couldn't help but feel a certain emptiness. He had played his part, but Johnny's absence was still a palpable weight in the air. "You ever think about what Johnny would have said if he saw all this?" Eddie asked, looking over at Martha, who sat beside him. Martha smiled, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I think he would have been proud, but he would have kept pushing. He wouldn't have stopped just because Briggs is gone." "Yeah," Eddie said, nodding. "He always believed that the truth was something that didn't just set you free. It kept you going, even after the hard parts." A silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when words aren't needed anymore. The kind that lingers when you've shared a struggle and finally found peace, even if it's not the kind of peace you expected. "I'm not sure what happens now," Martha said after a while, her voice softer. "The town's better, but it's still broken in places. And so am I." Eddie glanced at her, his voice steady. "It's not just the town that's broken, Martha. It's all of us who lived through it." "We all have to heal in our own way," Martha nodded. "Johnny always said that it wasn't the ending that mattered. It was the fight. And we've fought." Her words hung in the evening air, resonating with the weight of the years they had spent fighting an invisible enemy. But now that enemy was gone. Sheriff Briggs was behind bars, the truth had been exposed, and the town could breathe again. For Eddie, this chapter was closing, but it didn't feel like an ending. It was more like a beginning, one that would never have been possible without Johnny's relentless pursuit of justice. Johnny's legacy wasn't just in the truth that had been uncovered, it was in the hope he had ignited in the hearts of those who had been too afraid to speak up. "I think you're right," Eddie said, his voice quiet. It was never about the ending, it was about the fight, and Johnny made sure that fight didn't die with him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Eddie and Martha sat in companionable silence. The town was changing, yes, but so were they. And in the stillness of that moment, they both knew that Johnny's legacy would carry on. Through every truth uncovered, through every voice raised, through every person who chose not to be silent anymore. And in the end, that was all Johnny had ever wanted.